For 3 years while he was at South Carolina, all I would hear about was Jadeveon Clowney. Jadeveon Clowney this, Jadeveon Clowney that. JD is going to do this, Clowney's going to do that. Whenever he declares for the draft, he's one of those once-in-a-decade, once-in-a-generation talents. He's going to wreck the league. He's going to be a #1 overall pick, and a team's going to take a future Hall of Famer and laugh all the way because they were fortunate enough to get him. Me personally, I'm just being honest, I never quite got all the hype with Jadeveon Clowney. I never exactly understood why people were so big on this guy and so determined in their belief and so confident that this guy was going to be one of those once-in-a-decade, once-in-a-generation type of can't-miss prospects, and was no doubt about it in their minds a future NFL Hall of Famer. I just never saw that. I saw a good prospect, perhaps a very good prospect, but there were things that I observed, especially in his junior season at South Carolina, that did concern me. And when you're talking about taking a defensive end with a #1 overall pick, this guy had best damn sure be dominant. And I don't care how anybody wants to spin it, how much anybody tries to say otherwise. The fact of the matter is Jadeveon Clowney in his last season at South Carolina was far from dominant. He had those flashes of brilliance, but he also had those moments where he was able to be taken out of games, and that's just the way it is. I mean, you can sit there and talk about statistics don't matter, or sacks aren't necessarily a measurement of how well a defensive end impacts a game and how well a defensive end generates pressure, but at the end of the day, the number's there for a reason. It is a measurement. And when you're talking about taking a guy with potentially the #1 overall pick, and this guy has 3.5 sacks, I believe it was, in his junior season, to me, there's something amiss here. To me, there's something that's just totally off the radar. And it's kind of like one of these things where if you had one of those combine and workout warriors that shot up the board that you never fucking heard about, and then all of a sudden one day he was taken with the #1 overall pick and he had 3.5 sacks his last year in college, people would be crapping all over it. They'd be talking about, this is terrible, this is worse than taking Andre Bruce #1 overall back in '88. It would be all the time. But Jadeveon Clowney, there was that media hype. There was that promotion by ESPN and social media, what have you. So it created this whole kind of bullshit bubble, as I would call it, referencing Jadeveon Clowney like he was a second coming of Bruce Smith or Reggie White. And personally, like I said, I never got it. I thought he was a good prospect. I thought he was potentially a very good prospect. But he by no means was my #1 prospect heading into the 2014 NFL Draft. Top 10 talent, top 5 talent perhaps. But I had my reservations and I had serious concerns about this guy. I had concerns about his work ethic. I had concerns about his desire. I had concerns about his conditioning. I had concerns, and no matter how much the Jadeveon Clowney apologists want to sit there and spin it otherwise, those were valid, legitimate concerns. And now here we are, after 12 games of the 2014 season, the Houston Texans have announced that the #1 overall pick, their guy, the dream pairing with J.J. Watt and Jadeveon Clowney, is now going to be put on the shelf, put on IR, will miss the rest of the 2014 season because he has a knee injury that will yet again require surgery. Wow. The funny thing is with all the impact of the rookie wide receivers and then linebackers like Khalil Mack and C.J. Mosley, I almost forgot about Jadeveon Clowney. I mean, that's how insignificant he has been in 2014. And frankly, in my opinion, that's how ridiculous of a pick, a selection he was for the Houston Texans. But more on that in a moment. When you look at Jadeveon Clowney, this is a guy with immense physical talent that cannot be denied. His size, speed, athleticism combination is damn near second to none. But we're talking about a guy that now had a hernia problem and a surgery in the offseason, then had a knee injury that required him to miss several weeks, and now he's got another knee injury that will force him to miss the rest of the season. Jadeveon Clowney spent far more time on the injured list than he did on the actual football field in 2014. Jadeveon Clowney has more hits, more injuries, 3, than he does sacks. Jadeveon Clowney has more trips to the injured reserve than he has sacks in 2014. Jadeveon Clowney, as a rookie, the guy the Houston Texans said, we don't need a quarterback, we don't need this, we don't need Khalil Mack, we need Jadeveon Clowney. The guy that they just had to take with the #1 overall pick had 7 tackles and 0 sacks, and now has had 3 different injuries that will end up requiring a total of 3 surgeries. Now the question becomes, is Jadeveon Clowney always going to be that tease? And is Jadeveon Clowney going to be viewed as one of those epic all-time draft busts? I mean, this 2014 NFL draft class was really good. There's a lot of big-time talent and a lot of players that at this point in time could most certainly have a much bigger impact on the Houston Texans than Jadeveon Clowney most certainly has. Maybe it's too early, maybe it's too soon, or maybe some of you don't believe that a guy should be labeled a bust because of injuries and this and that. But Jesus Christ, even though it is only 1 season, what has Jadeveon Clowney shown you at the NFL level that in any way makes you think that he is going to be a big-time NFL player? The only thing he's shown a propensity for is a propensity for having his ass on the sidelines and taking an incredibly long time to return to action. And this is bad. And when I talked about this, I rallied and railed against this. The ridiculousness and the stupidity of the Houston Texans taking Jadeveon Clowney #1 overall. And this is one of the problems that were envisioned. What happens if Clowney can't stay healthy? Might not have been the biggest thing, but even if Clowney was healthy, and even if Clowney did play every game, how much better would the Houston Texans really be as a team? How much would he really improve that roster? Because you're talking about a guy that's really a 4-3 defensive end that you're trying to force into a position as a 3-4 outside linebacker. So it's not even his best, most natural position at the NFL level that he's being asked to play. You can sit there and talk about J.J. Watt this and J.J. Watt that, but Jesus Christ, I mean, at some point in time, you look at Jadeveon Clowney and you say, is this really the best choice? If you were going to take, if you're the Houston Texans and you just were insistent upon taking somebody on defense, even though you had the worst record in the league the previous season and you brought in an offensive-minded head coach, for some fucking reason, because you're idiotic, you took a defensive player #1 overall because, again, you're stupid. At least take Khalil Mack. At least take the natural 3-4 outside linebacker that is a better all-around player and is going to contribute in multiple facets. And even Khalil Mack hasn't had anywhere near the greatest season in terms of as an impact edge rusher, but he at least at times does get into opposing backfield, and he has shown the ability to defend tight ends in the passing game. He has shown the ability to be stout against the run. All of these things that you can't fucking envision with Jadeveon Clowney because you haven't seen much of shit out of him, and when you have seen something out of him, you ain't seen much. When I look at Jadeveon Clowney, he kind of reminds me of in a way is Courtney Brown. A guy that was tremendously physically talented. You looked at him and he looked the part. And you could see and believe that he would be the part. And because of injuries and because of this and that, it never happened. And as a result, he ended up becoming a big-time draft bust. I think the bigger problem here is for Houston's Texans team that right now is 6-6 as of this recording. This is a team that, even if it doesn't have the best chance, still is on the outside periphery of potentially contending for a wild card spot in the AFC. They've had an okay season. But what I still can't understand is why they thought that Jadeveon Clowney was going to be the best option for them. In a draft with so many impact players, why did they feel that this was their guy? Why did it have to be Jadeveon Clowney? And what I furthermore don't understand is why the Houston Texans didn't, if they were going to take Jadeveon Clowney #1 because they felt that he was one of those once-in-a-decade talents that was just too good to pass up, why did they not trade back up somewhere into the bottom of round 1 to get Teddy Bridgewater? Because I tell you what right now, it would be a lot easier, I think, for the Houston Texans organization, the fan base, and observers and media to absorb the fact that Clowney has stunk this year because in part he can't stay healthy, and when he does, he doesn't do shit on the field any damn ways. You could live with that if you had at least taken a Bridgewater and you said, here's our young quarterback to build around for the future. Because if you're the Houston Texans right now, you still have an incredible uncertainty at the quarterback position. You're 6-6. You're just kind of middle of the road and mediocre, and you're never really going to get anywhere. And you know Fitzpatrick's not the long-term answer. You know Mallett's not the long-term answer. You probably assume Tom Savage isn't the long-term answer. So you win 6-6, and you haven't figured out anything about the future of the organization other than the fact that you might be starting to pinch your whole ring because you're not sure Jadeveon Clowney is ever going to stay on the field consistently and live up to his immense potential. This is the ridiculousness of taking a guy like a Jadeveon Clowney, a defensive end like him, number 1 overall, and furthermore, not even playing him in a 4-3, but trying to convert him to being a 3-4 outside linebacker. In a draft that was so deep, in a draft that was so talented, with so many potential impact players, you could have taken a guy like a Khalil Mack and gotten a more natural 3-4 outside linebacker, and frankly, in my opinion, a much, much better all-around football player than a Jadeveon Clowney. Imagine if the Houston Texans had just sat there and maybe done what the fuck they should have done, and that was just taking Teddy Bridgewater number 1 overall. I understand Bridgewater hasn't exactly lit the fucking world on fire, but he hasn't been that bad, and it's not like he has a ton of help in Minnesota. And then you look at the Vikings right now, they're 5-7. Excuse me, they're only 1 game worse than the Houston Texans. And at this point in time, I look at the Minnesota Vikings, and I say I'd much rather be in their shoes. I think they have a much better path upwards than the Houston Texans do. The Minnesota Vikings did it right. I didn't necessarily agree with that at the time, them taking an Anthony Barr, but I was somewhat wrong about that. But they made sure they came back at the bottom of round 1 and got their freaking quarterback as well in Teddy Bridgewater. The Houston Texans, for some reason, decided that the best way to turn around a 2-14 campaign was with a defensive end who in his last year of college had 3.5 sacks and had some concerns about his conditioning, his work ethic, his attitude, and his ability to stay healthy. Then following that up with an offensive guard, following that up with a nose tackle, and then eventually taking a 25-year-old quarterback from Pittsburgh named Tom Savage. That doesn't exactly instill a ton of confidence, I think, in the Houston Texans fan base that the general manager and the head coach know what the fuck they're doing. Yes, it's great. You have J.J. Watt. You have that franchise piece. And unfortunately, while J.J. Watt could do lots of tremendous and wonderful things, he is ultimately one man. And unfortunately, he is one man that does not play quarterback, at least as far as we know just yet. The Houston Texans taking Jadeveon Clowney was an organization failing to learn from the mistakes of the past. Like I talked about, before, the Texans took Mario Williams number 1 overall in 2006. And they got their franchise impact all-pro potential Hall of Fame defensive end. Unfortunately, that came 5 years later when they took J.J. Watt number 11 overall out of Wisconsin. So you saw how this played out as an organization once before, and then you repeat the same damn mistake again, expecting things to be any different. And they just weren't. So the interesting debate now is Jadeveon Clowney going to be a bust? And if so, he would have to be classified as one of the biggest busts of all time. Injuries or not, at the end of the day, if you can't stay on the football field and you were the number 1 overall pick, you're a fucking bust. And how bad did the Houston Texans look right now for taking Jadeveon Clowney number 1 overall in a draft that was loaded with impact talent? So caution out there to NFL teams. Don't always buy into the hype. Don't always buy into the bullshit. And really think about things before you just sit there and make this selection, taking somebody like a Jadeveon Clowney number 1 overall and bypassing on quarterback and other impact players, especially when that's nowhere near your biggest need and there's even question about whether or not this guy is the best player on the board or not. Because if you don't carefully evaluate that, you could be making a potentially very tragic mistake that could set your organization back for years. And with the Houston Texans and Jadeveon Clowney, we could at some point in time get to that situation where we say, this was a mistake the Houston Texans will take years to make up for.